Hello, I'm recording this video to show off some of the features of the new sgran tilde and stgran tilde. These are stochastic granular synthesizers. They were originally developed for RTC mix, and before that CMix, that we've done some updates on, as well as ported to Max MSP for users who might prefer that. So first we'll take a look at sgran tilde, which works with periodic waveforms like sine waves or saw waves. So you see here I have 4 message boxes that I've plugged into the sgran tilde object. These are all necessary and must be banged before operation. These each represent parameters of grains, and these 4 numbers are going to represent a probability distribution of which grains will sample from. For instance, here I have grain duration. So I have the name of the parameter that I want to set the distribution for. Then I have the lowest possible grain duration in milliseconds, a midpoint, and the highest possible grain duration, also in milliseconds. These are all in milliseconds. And finally, a tightness control, which is going to control whether our distribution will clump around our midpoint or avoid it. Here we have 1.8, which is above 1, which means it will clump slightly towards that middle. If it were less than 1, it would avoid that midpoint. Similar deal for grain rate. Here, grain rate controls the time between successive grain onsets. I've got a low, mid, high, all in milliseconds again. I've got them much shorter so I can get lots of overlapping grains. And here I have a tightness of 1, which means it is a uniform distribution, which actually means that there will be an equal chance of any grain rate between 0.03 and 0.6. Frequency, simply in cycles per second or hertz. And finally, panning, which is going to be all values between 0 and 1, with, I believe, 0 representing the right speaker and 1 representing the left speaker. So let's give that a listen. Let's try messing around with this frequency tightness. So let's make this greater than 1 now. Set it to 4. Now we hear our grains clustering around that 440 center. Now what happens if I make it less than 1? Now grains are avoiding that center. You've got high grains and low grains, but nothing in the middle. So let's flip over to the Advanced tab for some additional features. So here you see these graphs. These are graphs of the probability distribution functions, or density functions rather, probability density functions, which will be much higher at values where it's more likely to have values chosen, and it'll be lower elsewhere. So here I've connected a slider into my grain rate with a $ argument such that I can move the mid control around. And I've connected that into this prob visual JavaScript script that I provided, which we can connect into a plot tilde to visualize what's going on. I would recommend just copying and pasting this to your patch to get what you want. So you can see here, you can see end here when I move around this grain rate. Here I've got higher grain rates and sparser texture, lower, faster grain rates, and a denser texture. This prob transition function allows us to interpolate between 2 different distributions for a given parameter. Here I've used grain duration. I have 2 very different distributions, one very short and one much, much longer, with also different tightness values. You can use this for some real-time control, or just finding the exact sound that you want. So here, instead of using the default Here I have no arguments provided directly to sgran tilde, which means that it's going to use a sine wave and a Henning table. But here I've provided arguments, which are max MSP buffers, which then I can set myself. So here, you'll see here is my default wavetable, a sine wave, which is set here with fill sine, but I can set this to a saw wave. Let's hear what that sounds like. Really bright sounding. I can do the same thing with my envelope. By default, it's a Henning window. And here I've set that manually to a Henning window, but here's a little trick that I found for some hacky ring modulation. Cool sounds. Finally, we have this optional, well, these are all optional arguments, but this attribute, grain limit, which we can define, which allows us to control the maximum concurrent grains, whether we want to be stingy with processing power or we just don't want things to clip. So let's see what happens when I flip between these. First, I'm going to set this really dense. Only 2 grains allowed at a time. 200 grains allowed at a time, which is what I had before. Finally, let's listen to 1000. This probably won't, perceptually, you won't notice a change in texture, but you'll notice it getting louder from more overlapping grains. All right, so now let's take a quick look at stgran tilde, which is the sampling-based version of this instrument. It's very similar. We're still using these 4 values for each parameter, but we've got some new parameters. So instead, because we're using samples instead of frequency, we're now going to use transposition instead. This is in linear octaves, such that 0 means no transposition, -1 means a down an octave, 2 means up 2 octaves, and we could have fractions of an octave if we wanted as well. Here we have a new parameter, grain head, which chooses where in the provided sample file, or buffer rather, object, we're choosing our grains from, where 1 represents the very start of the buffer and 0 represents the end of the buffer. Here I'm using this built-in max vibraphone sound that I've put in a buffer object. This is no longer optional, it is now required for stgran tilde that we define a max buffer for our source sample. Our envelope is still optional as well, and it defaults to a Henning window. So let's give a listen to that. So here, I've put together something that will allow us to use a live incoming signal and perform stgran tilde base granulation using that. I would recommend copying, pasting this patch because it uses a little trick using record tilde with the loop function on, using that function as a sort of built-in max circular buffer. So I'd recommend copying this all in and then to your own patch and altering it as you need. So let's give that a listen. Hello. Cool stuff. And finally, this is pretty much exactly the same as the sgran rather patch. Just of course different sounds possible using samples. You can really hear the result of changing my grain head control, where I can catch the onset of that vibraphone strike or catch the mellower tail. Great, so that's about it. Reach out if you have any questions or concerns.